Good evening. I'm Lucinda Andriani. I serve as the Deputy County Manager and also serve as the Public Works Director, as well as Flood Control District Administrator for Coconino County. I welcome you here this evening to the virtual flood risk open house regarding some recent flood mapping remapping project for the Oak Creek area, including Sedona. And we're glad to have you join us this evening. It's exactly 6:30 right now, and I'm going to give it a couple more minutes. We have a few people on. I'm going to give it a few more minutes here to see if anyone else joins us, and then we will start the program. We have a series of slides and various experts that will address various elements of the updated flood risk mapping that has taken place over the last couple of years, working with FEMA, and we'll march through that and then be available to answer questions at the end. And after I do a little intro here, talk a little bit about the agenda in a few minutes, someone will come on and explain how, if you have questions, how to ask those questions, what the mechanism for doing that on this platform, on this virtual platform is. So hold on just a couple more minutes. We're going to give it a couple more minutes and then get started. Thank you.
Can you turn the volume up?
That's as high as it can go, but I can put it through the car.
What's it supposed to be doing now? We're not getting anything.
She's just waiting for other people to come on, sounds like.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started again. I'm Lucinda Andriani. I serve as a Deputy County Manager for Coconino County, as well as the Flood Control District Administrator. I want to welcome you tonight to the flood risk open house related to new flood risk mapping that has been created for the Oak Creek area. And myself and a team of people who have been working on this effort, going to walk through a set of slides with you to share kind of background information. At the end, we'll be happy to answer questions, and the next person to speak after myself will share with you how to do that on this virtual platform. And also at the very end, we'll have a list of resources for you that will identify where to reach out if you have questions, where to go see the specific information about the maps, to see the maps specifically. Those maps have been mailed to property owners within this flood area, the Oak Creek flood area, special flood hazard area. So with that, let's go to the next slide here, Greg. So one thing is, I just want to provide kind of some background about how do these processes take place. And over the last approximately 10 years, FEMA has strongly encouraged flood control entities across the United States, so flood control districts, cities that manage floodplains, counties that manage floodplains, to update the FEMA flood risk maps. And many reasons for that, and those will be discussed, but primarily one of the key reasons is that things can change within a locality. Obviously, development, other things influence flood dynamics. But the technology has also improved dramatically since, for example, the maps that are in place now were created about 30 years ago, and that's very common throughout the country. That the mapping technology today, as one would expect, is dramatically different than it was then. The ability to do just much more sophisticated flood mapping with the new tools that are available is much more significant. So obviously it's important both to property owners and those managing floodplains to have a better and a clearer picture about what is the flood risk, and if for my property, what's the flood risk for this area. And using this new technology to remap areas is important to gain a better understanding. And we'll be walking through kind of that overview and provide some of that information about, what kind of information gets generated. So there'll also be a couple of different experts who will talk about what are the effects of the map changes that have come as a result of this remapping process. And so the way that this process works is we work closely with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Our authority, both Yavapai County and Coconino County's flood control district authority in this arena, comes from state statute, but frankly, more importantly, comes from FEMA. We are all, in effect, FEMA's kind of boots on the ground here relative to the National Flood Insurance Program and how that's managed locally, okay, within a local area or within a floodplain. And so, again, we've been working with them. They encouraged jurisdictions. Coconino County, we have done 3 different locations. This is the second of 3 that we're marching through this process, and we hire experts in this arena. You'll hear from one of them shortly, Linda Potter with Askins Engineering, and they're experts in this arena. They do this type of work all over the country, and they conduct these studies and look at the floodplain hydrology, and then develop a new set of proposed maps. Those are shared with FEMA. FEMA does a review of those maps, and then once questions, issues, any concerns are resolved between the entity, the jurisdiction, and FEMA, then we begin a process of public engagement, which is what is going on this evening, which launches a public comment and appeal process. And so that's what we're here basically launching tonight, is that public comment and appeal process. And others will speak to what that means. But you'll have an opportunity to review these maps and comment on them and or submit an appeal. Now, to submit an appeal requires a technical analysis. You can't just say, well, I don't like this. It's having a different impact on my property and I don't like it. An appeal actually has to have scientific and engineering work behind it to identify what do you identify as the error in the mapping, the remapping that was undertaken, that you identify there was an error for some reason. And so that's appeal is of a technical nature. A comment can be about anything, but an appeal really has to reside in. Again, people will speak more to that later, but it's important to understand that appeal is a very formal technical process in this framework that we're in with the remapping. So we'll talk through at the end what the remaining steps of this process are, but basically, simplistically, once the appeal process is concluded, FEMA gathers up any appeals, the comments, they review those, make a decision. The maps are ready to move forward. Typically they do. And then they move forward and we march through a set of steps, and then they become the formal maps that then new development, changes to regulations may take place. Those types of things are an outcome of that process. So this is an important process for people who own properties within floodplains. So as you can see, we'll step through a number of pieces here. Options if you disagree with the preliminary maps. As I mentioned, there's a comment process, there's an appeal process, and we'll again at the end talk about the next steps and the resources that are available to you to seek out in reviewing and then preparing any comments that you may want to submit. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Linda. That's going to speak to initially how to ask questions as we march through this. We are going to go through the entire presentation, and then we'll come back and go through the questions. But if you have a question that you want to submit as we go along, you can certainly do that. And then at the end, we'll answer all of the questions because some may be duplicative, of course. So with that, I'll turn it over to Linda. Thank you, Linda.
Great, thank you, Lucinda. So we are using a platform called GoToWebinar. And so what you'll see on your screen is a control panel window, which you can open by clicking on the orange icon arrow. And we ask that you please mute your phones. It looks like a microphone. If it's off, it'll be red with a line through it. And if it's on, it will be green. So please mute your phones. Also, we ask that if you have a question that you type it in, there is a question box. So in there, you can type in what your specific question is. And as Lucinda mentioned, we will answer that at the end. If you have any technical problems, you can also type those in the question box. We do have someone standing by to help you out with any technical problems or questions that you might have. So please type those in the question box as well. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over now to Michael Bishop. He's with FEMA Region 9, and he's going to give an overview of FEMA's risk map program. Michael.
So good evening, everybody, and thank you for making the meeting this evening. It's a pleasure to be here for myself. I'll introduce myself, and then for the purpose of the next couple of slides, the whole idea is for me to present to you where our authority comes from to connect with Lucinda and her team in Coconino County to actually either fund and or participate in the analyses that she described moments ago. So my name, again, is Michael Bishop. My title at FEMA Region 9, which is in Oakland, California, is Risk Analyst. And with our titles, we also get assigned geographies to pay close attention to and partner with to do the work that needs to get done under our authority. And I have been assigned the joy of working in Arizona for the past 5 or 6 years. So I know the folks on this call that are presenting. I've worked closely with them, and I am closely associated with the study that we'll be discussing today. So Lucinda mentioned that that FEMA is a partner in this and that it is a national program, and that is true. The national program focuses on the things that you see on the screen at the moment. The program is called the Risk Map Program, which is Mapping, Assessment, and Planning. That's the acronym of MAP. And then you can see in the circle, the outside of the circle, it's identify risk, assess the risk, communicate the risk, and mitigate the risk. So as a risk analyst, my typical focus is on the mitigate risk, but I am actually involved in all of the steps. Identifying the risk would be where the studies would be performed. Assessing the risk would be doing the analyses, the hydrology and hydraulics, and producing the products that we can all actually then look at and see the impacts of those. And then communication of the risk would be involved a meeting like tonight. So with that, let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned that I come from FEMA Region 9 office in Oakland, and the Region 9 area of responsibility includes California, Nevada, and the great state of Arizona and the Pacific Islands. So that is how what I do and where I work connects to the state of Arizona. There are 4 states and 3 territories, and in this area, we have in excess of, along with the Oak Creek study, another 124 and more ongoing mapping projects simultaneously. So with that, I want to then step into showing you how many of those are actually scattered around this great state of Arizona. And you can see them here. And Lucinda mentioned that this one is the second of 3 that we're working on in Coconino County. And so you can see that we're very busy in the state and a little busy in the county of Coconino. So with that, I think we can go on to the next slide. Is that right? Okay. And then what I would say in closing is that if you needed to speak with anybody, your greatest allies are going to be with the county. So if you start with Lucinda and her team, our connection is very strong with them, and they'll reach out and connect with us for anything that they need us to assist with. So with that, Linda, I'll turn it over to you to move on into the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Well, we're here to talk specifically about the Oak Creek remapping project. I'd like to go through a few items on defining acronyms and items that we talk about. And the first one is, we keep saying we're doing a flood remap. So what is a flood map? So this is something that's going to show your flood risk. We also often call them flood insurance rate maps or FERMs. And these are created and maintained by FEMA and its partners. We'd also like to say that there is no such thing as a no risk zone. There's always some risk of flooding, whether or not you are shown in a mapped flood zone. And this is going to help you make sound decisions about protecting your property. Next slide. And why do these flood maps matter? The community can use this to safely manage growth and development. It's also going to help individual property owners make decisions about their flood risk, and it's going to result in a safer and more resilient community. Lucinda touched on this earlier, but why do maps change? Well, flood risks do change over time, and there's many reasons for this. One is that the current maps are over 30 years old. We've had development that has occurred since the original maps were created. We also have additional years of rainfall and runoff data. So we have more statistics on what we expect to happen. And our technology has vastly improved in the past 30 years. So we're able to leverage all of these items to make a more accurate flood map. Next slide, please. So some key terms, we like to talk in acronyms a lot. So FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. A FERM and FIS, those are flood insurance rate maps and a flood insurance study, and these are the products that are maintained by FEMA. We might talk about a special flood hazard area, or SFHA. And these are high-risk areas that are shown on the FEMA flood maps. A floodplain is really any land subject to flooding, but in this presentation, we're specifically talking about floodplains as they are mapped on the FEMA maps. A base flood is the 1% annual chance flood event. We used to refer to this also as the 100-year event. However, we prefer to talk to them now as a chance, because you can have a 100-year flood occur on any given year, so it's a 1% chance of that happening. The base flood elevation is this water surface elevation that a 1% annual chance is predicted to reach or exceed in any given storm event. And a letter of final determination, or LFD, is a letter from FEMA, and this is going to say that the new flood maps are going to be effective in 6 months. Next slide, please. So now to show some of these terms on a map. So a floodway, you'll see it in the hatched pattern on the map on your left. So a floodway is the portion of the floodplain that's reserved without increasing the water surface elevation at designated height. So this is really where the water needs to be preserved and development should be minimized. The other flood zones shown on a flood insurance rate map, We have high risk areas. These are sometimes called a zone A or a zone AE. The difference between these is the zone A is a more approximate floodplain and the AE is more detailed. Our moderate risk areas are called the shaded zone X, which is a 0.2% annual chance of this occurring. And our lower risk areas are called zone X, and these are generally outside this 0.2% annual chance event. We're also going to show a cross section to illustrate what the floodway is. So the floodway is a portion of the floodplain reserved without increasing the water surface elevation to designated height. So as shown in this drawing, if you imagine that you are encroaching or building or squeezing the floodplain, you want to make sure that you have an area that's reserved that doesn't raise the water surface elevation a certain height. Next slide, please. Moving on to this specific study, what was studied and is going to become effective is the map on your right shows all of the floodplains that are studied. There's over 200 miles of floodplains that are occurring with the remapping. In Coconino County, the Oak Creek Canyon, that kind of follows State Route 689A. It's that portion of Oak Creek as well as Munns Canyon and some tributaries around Sedona. We also have other major streams in Yavapai County such as Dry Creek and Spring Creek that are being studied. Next slide, please. So how will an updated flood map impact me? So when effective, this may influence your future building, remodeling, and home purchase decisions. It may influence your flood insurance requirements and costs. And Bruce is going to talk a little bit later about how FEMA has an insurance rating option to reduce the financial impact of any flood insurance changes. And all new buildings and remodeling to existing buildings must be in accordance with these new maps once they become effective. Next slide, please. Who is involved? It's been about a 3-year process so far. The Yavapai County Flood Control District was the lead management agency on this study with funds from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, as well as participation from the City of Sedona, Coconino County Flood Control District, engineers and scientists, community organizations, residents and business owners, and most importantly, you. Next slide, please. So you can learn about your specific property flood risk. We have a project homepage, which is virtual flood risk open house. There's a lot of materials on this floodplain, on this web page, and you also have a link to look at the maps. Bruce, could you hit there it is right there. So if you go to the Oak Creek maps, you'll see a link that says identify your flood risk. When you click on that, you'll be directed to some maps where you can zoom into your specific property and look at what the old or existing floodplain is and what the new or proposed floodplain will be. So that is an illustration of what those maps look like on the right. Next slide, please. As far as staying informed, we're going to have some more information on the next step process, but you'll see from the arrow that we are right about to start the public comment period, which will be 90 days, and it starts at the end of September. So we're here kicking off the public comment and appeal period. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Bruce, who's going to talk more about the effects on flood insurance.
Great. Thanks so much, Linda. And as Linda mentioned, there are going to be some effects to property owners when the map changes occur. Maps are quite outdated in some areas, and some people will find that the risk has increased and others will find that it will decrease. And a lot of questions that we get are, what's that mean to me? How am I going to be affected? Am I going to have to get flood insurance? Do I no longer need to have flood insurance? So we're going to look into what those effects are. But first, I want to talk about a new rating program that FEMA has just released and actually goes into effect October 1st. So they're already quoting new policies. And it's called Risk Rating 2.0, Equity in Action. And the equity part is they're trying to make the rates more equitable to what the actual risk is, or fairer. And we don't have time to get into all that, but any policies that are written new, beginning October 1st of this year, so just in a couple of weeks, they will be using this whole new rating system. So insurance agents are in the process right now of learning how to use that new system. Quoting just started a couple of weeks ago. If you have an existing policy, it will start being rated using Risk Rating 2.0 with renewals starting April 1st. So then the question comes up, well, what about renewals starting October 1st? What if my policy could be cheaper for Risk Rating 2.0? And FEMA says if it's cheaper, you could actually renew, not the old way, but with the new way, if it's cheaper, if you're one of those policies renewing between October 1st and March 31st of next year. So it is a whole new rating system. And what's really unique about it is they no longer are using flood zones or base flood elevations. Now, you just heard Linda talking about how those are changing, and you'll hear John come behind me talk about how important they are from a building perspective, but they aren't being used directly for rating. So that's a big change there. And I'll mention how that affects on the rating options that you might have heard from past discussions of map changes. What it is being based on now are what the first floor height is. So what's the living space, the first floor, above the lowest adjacent grade? And how far are you from the flooding source? And what is the replacement cost? And what mitigation efforts? I mean, like, has it been elevated? Have you put in vents? Is the machinery and equipment like the AC or heating above the first floor? Those all will get discounts. And as opposed to the old way, which was only in high risk areas, those discounts will apply in moderate and low risk areas as well. So they're really trying to focus on the risk of that particular building and all the different characteristics geographically as well as that of the building. So a whole new way to do it. How does that affect with map changes? So right now, let's, as Linda indicated, we'll have some properties that will be newly identified to be at high risk. So here you have a house that's in Zone X. And when the maps change, and as you saw by timeline, it'll probably be the fall of next year at the earliest, if all goes well. We find that it's now in a Zone A or AE, which is known as a special flood hazard area or high risk. And in that case, the mandatory purchase requirement kicks in. That's where lenders who are federally regulated or insured are required by law to require the property owner to obtain and maintain flood insurance. So it's not a FEMA requirement, it's a lender requirement, and the lenders have to enforce that. So a lot of people say, oh my gosh, it's going to be expensive, I have to go get flood insurance. But actually, FEMA provides a cost-saving option known as the newly mapped procedure or newly identified to be at high risk rating option. So if you get a policy within the first 12 months after the effective date, so let's say it becomes effective September 2022, you have until the end of August 2023 to get a policy, but my point is, if you're at risk, don't wait. You can start at a low cost premium and then over time increase until you get to the actual full risk rate. And law says it can't increase more than 18%. That's the most it can increase per year. Now, some of you may have heard in the past years, for decades actually, there's been an option known as grandfathering, where you could lock in that lower Zone X for future rating. No, you can't anymore. Grandfathering doesn't apply because Risk Rating 2.0 no longer uses flood zones. So if you do see an increase in base flood elevation with these maps, that is not going to affect your rating. So I just wanted to clarify that. But if you do move from a Zone X to Zone A, they do have this rating option known as newly mapped procedure. So it slowly increases, and so you don't get hit all at once with a higher cost. But as I mentioned earlier, gosh, if right now you go into that viewer that Linda talked about and you find out that you are at a high risk right now, and as Lucinda mentioned, we're going to be going through an appeal period, and then we'll resolve appeals and the like, and I'll cover that again for you. That's going to take a while before they're effective. Mother Nature could easily flood again, and we've seen that this past summer, how devastating that can be. So I'd say if you've got to get a policy now. But we also see, because we have better technology, better data now, as Linda pointed out, we see in cases where the floodplain shrinks. So the house, which used to be in a zone A or AE, high risk, is now in a zone X. And when that happens, the mandatory purchase requirement disappears. So lenders will be sending out notices to those affected buildings owners saying, hey, you no longer are required to carry flood insurance. Well, what happens is you see these policyholders grab their policy and they run around in their hand with the policy saying, we don't need flood insurance anymore. The bank told us we don't need it. No, the bank said you no longer are required. And so, as Linda pointed out, we all live in a flood zone in Arizona. It's just the level of risk. And where it can rain, it can flood. So we strongly encourage that you maintain that coverage. Under risk rating 2.0, though, we don't change rates because of a flood zone. So that's not going to affect the rates. But as John will explain, it will affect building requirements. But just because you've changed zones and you no longer are required to carry flood insurance doesn't mean the risk is not there. It's just been reduced. And a fact about flood claims in Arizona is that 30% of them are in moderate to low risk areas. So again, where it floods, it can rain. So keep your home and contents protected. Get a policy, because there still is that risk. But also there's a whole lot of properties that are not affected by this map change. There's no change in risk. So some that are in a high risk area may stay there. Some that are low risk will stay there. So if you have a flood insurance policy, sit down with your insurance agent and talk with them to say, do I have the right amount of coverage? If the lender requires it, they don't require replacement costs usually. They only require the amount of the loan typically. So you may not get replacement cost coverage when it rains. And are the contents fully covered? Again, if it's lender required, they're not going to require contents. So when it does flood and you have your clothing, your furniture, appliances, all those things ruined, where are you going to get the money to cover that? So make sure you have that. And if you don't have coverage, talk to your agent to see what's the best coverage for you and what's the lowest quote that you can get. So in summary, if there's an increase in risk going from zone X to zone A or AE, there's that money saving option called newly mapped procedure, where it's newly identified to be at high risk. If there's a decrease in risk, again, A to X, the risk is not removed, it's just reduced. So keep your coverage because the risk is still there. And finally, there's many of you that are not going to be affected, but this is a good time to sit down and talk with your agent and say, okay, am I fully covered? Do I have what I need to have? So with that, I'd like to pass the baton over to John Carr with Coconino County to talk about how the effects of map changes are on building requirements, now that we've talked about it on insurance requirements, and they are different. So John, I'm going to pass it on to you.
All right, thank you, Bruce. I am John Carr, I'm the engineering supervisor for community development, and I'm going to be talking about the effects on map changes for building requirements. Next slide, please. So we talked about the time frames. There is the before letter of determination, which is where we are right now. The next stage is, next slide, is after letter of final determination. And then finally, once after the maps become effective. And I believe the next slide is going to say that it's around December 2022. We'll follow up and make sure that number is still accurate. Next slide, please. So one of the things I'd like to talk about is substantial improvement, substantial damage. And just because you're doing improvements in a floodplain doesn't necessarily mean you have to build to the higher standards. But I'll talk a little bit about what the purpose of substantial improvement, substantial damage is. The reason behind it is to discourage continued development in floodplains and discourage adding more and more investment into existing structures. Next slide, please. So over time, it reduces the amount of burden on the taxpayer. The overall plan is to reduce the cost for all the people in the floodplain and the community. Next slide. And the regulations apply if the following scenarios are in play. First of all, if it's in a special flood hazard area and the structure doesn't meet the regulatory flood elevation as identified in the current firm, and the cost of repairing or improving is more than 50% of the market value of the structure itself, and it's the repair cost divided into the value of the structure. That does not include the property. Next slide, please. And here's an example of a property in Sedona. And in previous outreach programs, I looked for a vacant lot. And unfortunately, in this case, I couldn't find many in the Oak Creek Canyon area. So I've selected a lot that is already developed on. And so let's go to the next slide. So here's that example property. Now, if you know somebody that owns this property, or if this property owner is watching now, please understand we're just using this as an example. So we're going to throw down a potential building spot. So it's a proposed structure or substantial improvement. And we want to find out what the floodplain requirements are. So what we do is look at the effective map and the preliminary map. So the effective map is what governs today. So let's go to the next slide and look at that. And then you'll see we have the house in the same location. You have to click to get ahead, I think, on that one, Bruce. So the house is in the same location there. As you can see, no floodplain permit is required because the structure is not in a special flood hazard area. Special flood hazard area for Arizona is any zone with an A in front of it. There are other special flood hazard zones, V zones, but those are on the coast, so that it doesn't apply here. Let's go to the next slide, please. We're going to look at the preliminary map. So here's the preliminary map. We're going to put it at the same site, and you can see it's on the 0.2 annual percent chance area, and that does not require a floodplain permit. So now let's take a look at another location. Next slide, please. So here we're pretending that this is an undeveloped lot, and we decided to put the house right there. And we're going to look at how is the project location impacted by the preliminary map, or the effective map and the preliminary map. So again, we'll look at the effective map first. That's what's in play right now. Next slide, please. We'll plop that down there again. And now you see that the structure is partially in a special flood hazard area. And what that will require is a floodplain permit. So, and it will require us to build the lowest floor 1 foot above the base flood elevation. Next slide. Now let's look at the preliminary map. And the preliminary map, it's not much different there. So we're looking at the same scenario. I don't know if you noticed, but the base flood elevation changed a little bit. In the previous slide, I believe it was at 4170, and now it's 4171.5. So it's a little higher. As Bruce mentioned, that doesn't come into play for rating purposes, but it does come into play for floodplain permits. So you would be required to get a floodplain permit and elevate the lowest floor at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. Let's try one more location, and this is the location that's going to make Michael Bishop cringe, or anybody that's in floodplain management cringe. So we're putting it on the far west side of the property, and now we're going to look at the effective map and the preliminary map again. Next slide. And go ahead. So now, as you can see here, the house is in a floodway, and that's something we definitely want to avoid. And it triggers a much higher standard. It's the floodplain permit will be required. The house would have to be elevated 1 foot above the base flood elevation. And you'd have to provide a no-rise analysis prepared by a professional engineer. Essentially, what that does is Linda has done the modeling through this area. And so what you would do is you would place that house in the model per se and see if it makes the water rise. Like if you were to stand by a small creek, for example, a really small one, and you put a big boulder in there, it's going to make the water rise. That's the same kind of concept. So you need to show that putting that structure in there will not cause any rise, and that means not even 1/100th of a foot. Next slide, please. So here is this is the preliminary study, and again, the floodway is approximately the same area that the effective study is in. So we're kind of looking at the same scenario here. We would need to get a floodplain permit. We would be required to do the no-rise analysis again. There are things that engineers can do to improve that. For example, the location where that house is right now, if it were to be rotated such that it was more oriented north-south, potentially it could have less of an impact. So there's things they can do. This is just an example of the moral of the story is stay out of the floodways whenever you can. Let's take a next slide, look at the flow charts. And these flow charts are available online, and it talks about what to do before the letter of final determination. The next one is after the letter of final determination, and then after the maps become effective. These flow charts may seem a little complicated. They're really not, and we'd be happy to walk through them with you. Our contact information will be at the end of the slide. And the next slide, please. So I'll turn this over to Bruce Bender again, who will be talking about options if you disagree with the maps.
Great. Thanks so much, John. And I apologize for the delay of the slides. For some reason, there seems to be a longer time delay for those slides there. So I apologize for that. So you've heard about the project. You've heard about what the effects are on insurance, and that FEMA, if you buy through flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program, has a rating option to help reduce the financial impacts that flood map changes have. You then just heard from John that flood maps changes can affect building requirements, both whether there's change in flood zone and or change in the base flood elevation. But what if it comes along and you say, "What? I don't like what it says there. I disagree with what the map says." So this next section will briefly go through some of the options that you have. And basically there's two. Right now, as Linda mentioned, one option is the appeal or comment that can be done, which is a formal process that occurs after the preliminary flood maps release and is submitted during the 90-day appeal and comment period, which is targeted to start September 29th, so not too far from now. The other option, going the opposite direction, as you see, is the letter of map change, which occurs after the flood maps become effective. And it's specific for a building, so you're not changing an entire area, but specific to the area, because there are times when, because of the scale that we're doing the study, we can't get down to individual property level necessarily. There are some scale limitations in a high risk area, and we may find that it's in a it's elevated high enough that it could be actually out of the floodplain. So where does this all happen and fall in? Well, this is the timeline study where you can see that in the beige color, where it says submit appeals and comments in the blue triangle box, it'll start September 29th and finish in December. Once FEMA receives all of their comments, and you'll send them through the community and then up to FEMA, they will review them, they'll resolve them, and once they're all resolved, they will then issue a letter of final determination to say to the communities, which will be Sedona, Coconino, and Yavapai County, that, hey, the maps will become effective in 6 months. So then that gives time for the counties and city to make sure their ordinances are up to date to accept those new maps, known as 6-month compliance. And then at the end is the maps become effective, which is targeted towards the end of next year. And when that happens, that could be the second time that people have an opportunity more at the building level to change what their flood risk is shown to be on the maps. So let's take a closer look at each of these. First one, when a preliminary flood map is released, FEMA provides a 90-day appeal and comment period, which occurs anytime there's a revised base flood elevation or new flood hazard zones boundaries are established. So property owners and builders and developers and others now have an opportunity to submit an appeal, which is evidence that they believe that their property has been or area has been improperly mapped into a zone A or AE. As indicated here on your screen, an appeal requires an analysis done by FEMA and mappers to show that it's been scientifically or technically incorrect. So it's just not a matter of saying, I think it's wrong. An appeal, though, is something more simple where they say, hey, the road location is wrong, or the name is not correct, or the corporate limit has been changed. So the first one, again, with the appeal is basically saying something formal, technical, scientific, and the second is the comments. Once FEMA receives those appeals and comments, they'll evaluate the data, request for additional information if there is any needed, and then they'll issue an appeal resolution. They'll submit the letter through the county, and then all the appellants, those who appealed, will receive it as well. Once all appeals and comments are resolved, the flood map is finalized and the letter of final determination is then sent to each county, and then the maps become effective in 6 months. Now, occasionally, as mentioned, a building is situated on a higher ground, it's higher than what that base flood elevation is. And so it may, though, because of the limit of scale, may inadvertently put into Zone A, the high risk area. When new maps become effective, so keep in mind, it happens when new maps become effective, property owners may submit mapping and survey information to request what's known as a letter of map amendment. And as Linda pointed out, we're in a world of acronyms here, LOMA, for a letter of map revision based on fill, or LOMAR F. This letter, if it turns out that the lowest adjacent grade is above that base flood elevation, then the letter actually removes the federal mandatory purchase requirement when it becomes effective. But as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, the risk hasn't been reduced. We're just showing that it is less. And this letter is actually revising or amending the map. And in today's technology, it's actually a point now on the map because the maps are all digital. So it'll be saved on. So in case you sell the property, that LOMAR F or LOMA will be actually something you could pull up online at the FEMA Map Service Center. Again, that is only after the maps become effective. So again, two options that you had, appeal and comments, which is coming up that appeal period, September 29th, or for your particular property, if it looks pretty close to be out of the special flood hazard area, when the maps become effective, you can look to file a LOMA or LOMAR F as it's called. So we covered a lot of information this evening. Let me pass the baton to Lucinda to finish it up and take us back to the timeline so you know where we are and where we're going. So with that, Linda, I will pass it over to you.
All right, thank you, Bruce. Appreciate that. A lot of information there, we understand. And Bruce showed this earlier, but you can see where we are now. And that, as he mentioned, we'll be entering the appeal and comment period here at the end of September. And then that will run through the end of December. And that's the time within which, if you're going to consider submitting an appeal or comments, that you'll need to do so. And then those will be reviewed by FEMA and of course the local jurisdictions as well, but primarily by FEMA. And then the community receives what's called a letter of final determination. And then there's a 6-month compliance period, I'll say waiting period in effect. And the new flood insurance rate maps then will go into effect. And typically, I guess he noted that typically takes approximately a year. So it would be expected that these new maps would go into effect fall of 2022. So that's the timeline that we are within. Next slide, please. And here are the resources. And I wanted to be clear. There's a number of different resources here that you can see, different websites and so forth. And to view the map changes, the map changes viewer, you can see there's this Oak Creek map changes viewer that you can go in and actually see the details of the maps as discussed earlier. And you can certainly, if the information that's shared tonight at the open house, that's available on that website, the Yavapai website as well. And on the right there for Coconino County, you can see the FEMA flood map at coconino.az.gov. Much of the information, all of the information should be, I believe, is there as well. And certainly there's a phone number there as well. That's Coconino County Public Works. You can call that number, and frankly, you'll get a receptionist and indicate that you have questions regarding or need information regarding the Oak Creek flood mapping, and that will go to our community relations manager, who then in turn will respond to you and answer any questions that you may have. So and again, there's numbers there as well for the city of Sedona as well as Yavapai County, and they can help guide you as well if you're within those areas. So I think that's the key pieces of resources here. Again, lots of information, and again, I want to thank those that participated in the meeting tonight, and we're open to any questions. Linda, do you want to specifically respond? So where specifically on the websites do they submit, if they have an appeal or a comment, which specific website should they submit that to?
Sure. So on the yavapaiaz.gov website, under Oak Creek Maps, we have a specific link right there that you can click on that has directions and forms and instructions on how to file any comments or appeals. And I'd also like to point out, if you're listening to this and you have maybe what you're thinking might be a comment or appeal, please reach out to those folks in your jurisdictions first. They can really help you out, maybe talk through the issues first before going through all the paperwork to file a formal appeal. And the only other thing I was going to mention was if you have any questions for us, we've got some time, we can answer them now. You can please type those in the question box. I don't see any questions as of right now. We'll give it a few minutes here, see if any come up. So what Bruce has shown on the screen right there are the 4 boxes to click on where you can look at the specific map on your property, and also what he's pointing out right there is what to do if you have a comment or appeal. So we've got one website for all 3 jurisdictions, whether you're in Sedona or Coconino County or Yavapai County. Please go to this page with a lot of other resources, phone numbers, emails, and that'll help you there.
Great, thank you, Linda. So
Sure.
if anyone has any questions, please submit those. Thank you.
Linda, you may have answered the question, but it says, who do we call if we have questions? And again, if you look on the right side of the screen is where you are located, as Lucinda pointed out, those are your contacts and your phone numbers.
Absolutely, and the Coconino County email address right there, FEMA flood map at coconino.az.gov, is monitored by more than one person, so you'll make sure and get a response if you send an email through that, or like Lucinda mentioned, calling the Public Works number if you're in Coconino County.
All right, are there any other questions that we can see there, Bruce or Linda?
No other ones have come in.
All right, well, thank you everyone for the presentations, and thank you those with the public that participated. Again, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or concerns or have difficulties navigating any of these web pages to secure the information that you need. So
We did
thank you
have
very much.
one. Yeah,
Oh,
we did have one
okay.
question come in. And the question, whoops, I just lost it here. The question is, can a city or county require more stringent requirements than FEMA? I would just like to start off answering that one. A city or county can require more stringent requirements than FEMA. I don't know specifically of any in these 3 jurisdictions that are more stringent than FEMA. Don't know if anyone else has the answer to that. I don't believe that we are. The state of Arizona actually, as a state, has a 1-foot elevation requirement that is more stringent than FEMA has. But that's the only big one that I know of.
Yeah, and Coconino County has this is John, Coconino County has the 1-foot requirement as well.
And Lucinda, you are a CRS community, correct?
Correct. And Bruce, do you want to explain what that is?
Yeah, so basically, those who raise their hand to FEMA and say, hey, I want to do more than what the minimum requirement is to the question, there are certain activities they can do that help reduce risk as well as help improve risk communication. And with that, they get points and credits. And for each class, starting at 10 is a 0, down to 1 is 45%, 40%, 45. They get 5% discount. So Lucinda, you guys are CRS County, is it 5 or 6, 5?
I think we're at John. John, what level are we at now? 8?
Correct, we are 8. We are 8.
8, okay, so that is a 10% discount. So by the county going above and beyond the minimum requirement, back to the person's question, you all that have NFIP policies are enjoying a 10% discount because of those efforts.
I also
so
want to thank you. I also want to really emphasize to people that even if you determine that your risk is lower now by looking at the maps, or maybe you've joined this meeting and you're not even in this floodplain, I want to emphasize again what Bruce earlier, everyone is at flood risk in Arizona. And that we have a monsoon season this year in particular. We saw several events in our county, many events, frankly, that were over a 200-year flood rainfall event, and many significant intense storms that cause flooding. And many people think, well, we talk a lot about post-wildfire flooding here in Arizona, and we're certainly experienced that here in Flagstaff. But we had as much, or frankly, more impact outside of that museum fire flood area than we did within it, because we had proactively mitigated that area to a large extent. Certainly, we still had much impact within that area, but we had a 300 and 400 year event that literally destroyed a home. Nothing to do with post-wildfire flooding. And they did not have insurance, flood insurance. Your normal homeowner's insurance does not cover flood impacts. You have to have flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program, which you can secure through your agent, your insurance agent, or directly through the NFIP. And I can't encourage people enough, tell your family members, friends, others, get flood insurance. I'm in a very low risk area where I live, but I have flood insurance because I know at any given day we could have a major rainfall event in this area and I could be impacted. And any flood water from outside the home that impacts a home or a business is considered flood impact. And so it's really important that I frankly think everyone in the state probably really should have flood insurance, because there's no other way to recover that cost that of damage or loss.
Perfect. Yeah, 30% of the flood claims in Arizona are from those low risk areas.
That's right. And I wrote that down because I'm doing a letter out to the museum flood area right now, and I want to reiterate, I continue to, we've been reiterating since the fire in 2019 how important it is to have flood insurance, and unfortunately many of the people impacted had not secured flood insurance, and they have no way to recover any of those repair costs now. So
Yeah.
all right, well, I think that looks like the end of the questions. And again, I want to thank everyone and wish you a great fall. And certainly, again, don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you and good night.
All right, thank you.